Dare to Defy Part 5, Parallel World Book 3, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Chapter 48. Stand up, Morgan. It was weird to hear my real name used. I'd gotten used to being called Hannah in the last few days. With the help of the two enforcers, I stood, my legs unsteady. They led me out of the room and toward the elevators. Mrs. Reynolds stayed behind. All the other kids had cleared out by now, so no one was around to stare, which was a small mercy. I was sure the news of my presence was racing around Camp Willowmoss at that very moment. One of the men waved his card in front of the reader, and a moment later the elevator doors opened and they nudged me inside. He chose the first floor, which surprised and terrified me. The only time I'd been on that floor was when I'd arrived. I didn't know what else was down there. Were they taking me to the other facility now? It was after 9 o'clock at night. Wasn't it kind of late? And Mrs. Reynolds had said I would be transferred in the morning. Moments later, we arrived on the first floor. The enforcers walked me to an area I'd never been to. We stopped in front of a windowless door, and one of the enforcers waved his card in front of a reader. I heard a distinctive click. He opened the door, removed my handcuffs, and shoved me inside. Then the door slammed closed behind me. I spun around and pulled on the handle. It was locked. I slowly turned around and looked at my new home. Bolted to the floor was a cot with a thin mattress. Folded sheets were stacked neatly on top of it. In one corner of the room stood a metal toilet. Nearby, a metal sink was attached to the wall. All 4 walls were made of concrete. This wasn't a room. This was a jail cell. And I was the criminal who had been apprehended. There were no windows, just a tiny vent in the ceiling to keep me from suffocating. None of my things were in here, not even my toothbrush. Self-pity, hopelessness, and growing panic washed over me in waves, threatening to drown me. I slowly spun around as desperation built inside me. Then I remembered that the camera was still going. At least they hadn't taken away my glasses. I held still and stared at the blank gray wall. "If you can hear me, please come and get me right away." I enunciated each word, trying to control the shaking in my voice. With a concrete wall surrounding me, I didn't have great confidence that the Wi-Fi would be able to penetrate enough to grab the message, but I grasped onto the sliver of hope that it had worked. What other hope did I have? I turned off the camera. Exhausted, but not really sleepy, there was nothing else for me to do but lie down. I took the sheets, which were just as scratchy and stiff as the ones in my room on the 8th floor, and stretched them over the thin mattress. I left my clothes on, but removed my shoes before climbing between the sheets. The pillow was pitifully flat, but it was better than nothing. I stared at the ceiling. The light was on, and there was no light switch. I tried to focus on the positives. The only one I could think of was Amy being released. I pictured her reuniting with Mom and the boys and felt a tiny tremor of happiness. The lights went out, and I was plunged into darkness. I flashed back to my journey through the tunnel and the terror I'd felt when I dropped the lantern, which had extinguished the light. When that had happened, I'd been certain that hideous creatures with sharp fangs were marching toward me, ready to tear me apart. I'd had no idea that instead I was marching toward a life filled with people who were much worse than any creature I could have imagined. People who were happy to tear families apart and take a person's freedom just because that person was overweight. I finally fell asleep, and when the lights abruptly turned on, I woke up. Rubbing my eyes, I sat up and wondered what was going to happen next. Jack and Danny had failed to rescue me, and even though I wasn't surprised, the sting of disappointment was still sharp. Fresh despair swept over me as I pondered my fate. Would I ever see my family again? Would the people at Camp Willowmoss really let Amy go, or was this all for nothing? I threw the covers back and pushed myself off of the cot. then remembered the cot I'd slept on in the little hut that had led me here. I hoped to see that little cot again when I passed through the hut on my way back to my world. I put my shoes on, then cleaned myself up the best I could under the circumstances, and tossed the useless contact lenses down the toilet. Then I sat on the bed and waited. I had no idea what time it was, but the uncertainty of my fate kept me on edge. When I heard the click on the lock disengaging, I sat up straight, on high alert. The door swung open, and an enforcer brought in a tray with breakfast, including the 2 power bars that I normally got with each meal. With all the stress, I had no appetite, but after he left, I forced myself to eat. Who knew what the day would hold and when I would be offered food again? I forced down the food, but I was so upset by everything that my stomach rebelled and I vomited the entire meal into the metal toilet. A while later, the door began to open. My anxiety went through the roof. This is it, I thought. They've come for me. I was just ready to get it over with. A pair of enforcers stood in the open doorway. "Let's go," one of them said, motioning for me to stand and approach them. I did as he commanded, and when I reached the doorway, his partner twisted my arms behind my back and put the handcuffs back on. I hadn't slept well, tossing and turning all night, and my mouth tasted like vomit, which just added to my misery. They led me down a hall that looked familiar. It was the same hall the receptionist had taken me when I'd first arrived only 4 days before. Had I failed so quickly? Shame fell over me like a large boulder, making me want to curl up and die. We walked down the hall and stopped at a door. It was the same door I'd looked at from the other side, from the reception area. But when I'd seen it before, I'd been hopeful that my mission would go well. I'd had no idea things would turn dire so quickly. "Here we go," one of the enforcers said to the other. I wondered what he meant, but when he swung the door open and nudged me through, I found out. Chapter 49. Dozens of reporters were crammed into the reception area, their cameras trained on me. All at once, they started shouting my name, I guess trying to get my attention so they could get a good picture of me, which would be difficult with the way I looked just then. Hating every single person in this world, I ignored them. Then I saw Amy sitting next to Mom and Dad. Dad! A pair of enforcers kept the media away. My family were the only people in the room I cared about. They were the only constant, whether in this world or the other. When Amy saw me, she jumped up, but when she tried to run toward me, one of the enforcers standing guard held her back. She pushed at his arm, trying to break free, but she couldn't overcome his superior strength. Mom and Dad stood too. Mom's hand flew to her chest, and Dad squeezed his eyes shut. They both looked dazed. Had the enforcers woken them early that morning to come to this sideshow, or had they at least had the courtesy to let them know the previous night? I was so surprised to see Dad. I hadn't known he was out. When I looked at him, he didn't appear strong and vigorous, like a man who'd just spent months getting healthy. No, he was pale and worn down. What had his experience been like at the F.A.T center where he'd been kept? "Morgan?" Mom called out, her brow wrinkled with concern. Was she having trouble recognizing me with my short black hair and glasses? It didn't matter. I desperately wanted to run to her and tell her how much I loved her and hide in the protective circle of her arms. But I knew she couldn't protect me from the injustices in this world any better than she'd been able to protect Amy. "Mom," I called back. The media went into a frenzy of picture-taking as they increased the volume of their cries to get my attention. I strained against the grip of the enforcers who held me in place as I imagined the pride they must be feeling to have finally captured Morgan Campbell. At least Billy's free, I thought. They'll never catch him. He's too clever. The thought gave me some comfort, but I missed him fiercely all the same. The enforcers walked me to a chair and pushed me into it, then cuffed my legs to the chair, as if I would have any chance to get away. I looked at Mom, Dad, and Amy, who stared at me helplessly. Then, Trying to tune out the reporters, I glanced around. A podium was positioned in the corner of the room. What was that for? I didn't remember seeing it when I'd arrived a few days earlier. Moments later, Dr. Tasco, the man who ran Camp Willowmoss, the man who took so much pleasure in watching us participate in the Saturday Challenge, walked through the door that I'd come through only moments before. He strode over to the podium, a wide smile on his bespectacled face. Seeing his glasses reminded me of the camera in my glasses, and for a second I thought it was a shame my bound hands prevented me from turning it on. Then I almost laughed. There was no need for my camera. The media would record everything. "Good morning," Dr. Tasco said. He seemed to be in a fantastic mood. The crowd settled down, their eyes trained on Tasco. "As you can see for yourself, we've captured Morgan Campbell, wanted for assaulting an enforcement officer." He paused to give everyone a moment to let that sink in, while they stared at me like a caged animal in a zoo. I noticed he didn't mention my and Billy's escape. Maybe he wanted to preserve the fiction that no one was held here against their will. He continued, "Today we will transfer her to a facility with higher security. Camp Willowmoss is meant for those needing to lose weight, as well as those who have committed minor infractions, not for serious offenders like Morgan Campbell." They were treating me like I was a mass murderer or something. My face flamed red at the implication. Not wanting to make eye contact with anyone, I stared at my lap. I was ashamed, but not because I'd stabbed Hansen. He deserved it and more. But because I'd failed. Failed to get the information that could have turned the tide of public opinion against fat centers like this one. Failed to conceal my true identity before I'd been able to get out. But at least I'd succeeded in getting Amy out, just not in the way I had wanted to. "As promised," Tasco went on, "we've released Amy Campbell to her parents." He pointed to Amy, Mom, and Dad. Mom and Dad looked shell-shocked, but Amy looked angry. "I'd like to thank everyone involved in apprehending Morgan Campbell." He lifted his chin. "It's always gratifying to get violent criminals off of the street." The absurdity of his comment almost made me smile. Me? A violent criminal? What about Dr. Tasco's enforcement officers? Grown men who are twice my size. Men who are allowed to punch me, a teenage girl, in the stomach. If Hansen had hit me just right, he could have killed me. Or what about the enforcers who had hit my legs and Amy's legs with their batons when we didn't perform the way they demanded when we were in the gym? Those were violent criminals. I'd only been defending Billy from Hansen's punches. "I'm sure you're all curious as to how we were able to capture her." I was interested too, and I turned my attention back to Tasco. "A woman purporting to be her mother brought her here several days ago under the pretense that she needed to lose weight. As you can see," he said as he glanced my way, "her appearance has changed. We believe there are other people involved in this deception, and others are investigating that angle." That was just perfect. Jack and Danny wouldn't come anywhere near me now, which meant it was all but certain that I would have zero chance of getting to the tunnel in time. I imagined living the rest of my life in this world, never having the hope of getting back to my home world, always having to deal with the intrusion of the government, always being known as a criminal. A powerful sense of panic grabbed hold of me, and I fought back the urge to vomit, swallowing repeatedly to push the bile back down my throat. My gaze ricocheted around the room as I searched for any means of escape. The only way out was through the main door. Assuming I could get through the crowd, I would have to get past the enforcers who were stationed around the room. The chances of escape were somewhere between slim and none. It felt as if a vice had clamped around my chest, and I leaned forward slightly to keep the dizziness at bay. A hard grip on my shoulder yanked me upright, and I turned to see one of the enforcers glaring at me. No one could help me now. I was on my own. My attention went to Amy, who sat next to Mom and Dad, and I felt a glimmer of happiness that at least she was safe now, as safe as anyone could be who lived in this world. As long as I was locked up and serving my time, she would be okay. Tasco continued his story, which pulled my focus back to him. We haven't yet determined why Miss Campbell tried to impersonate an innocent civilian. She and the people working with her are either very stupid or very naive. I looked at Tasco, and he turned and looked at me, which drew everyone's attention back to me. They must have realized that the retinal scanner cannot be fooled, and each resident at Camp Willowmoss is required to weigh in daily using the retinal scanner for identification purposes. He looked away from me. I had been a complete idiot for believing Jack and Danny when they claimed they had a way to trick the retinal scanner. The people at Camp Willowmoss must have known it was me from the first time I'd gotten on the scale 3 days before. I only wondered why they hadn't arrested me right away. Maybe to give themselves time to pull this circus together. After the retinal scanner alerted us to her presence, we were able to verify her identity using a blood sample taken during processing, matching her DNA to what was in the government's database. When Dr. Bradley had drawn my blood, it had never occurred to me that it would hold the key to my identity. But even if I'd thought of that at the time, what could I have done? My fake mother had already brought me in. At that point, I couldn't have left if I'd wanted to. As it turned out, this mission had been guaranteed to fail from the start. Did Jack and Danny know that? Or had they really believed it could work? Or had they been using me to get what information they could until I was inevitably caught? I'm not taking any questions, Tasco said. At this time, Morgan Campbell will be transferred to Camp Stonewater. The enforcers undid the chains from my ankles and pulled me up. Can I at least tell my family goodbye? I yelled loud enough for everyone to hear. That got the attention of the media, and they all looked at Dr. Tasco. Perhaps he felt the pressure of their attention, because he seemed reluctant when he said, Certainly. He motioned for the enforcers to bring me to Mom, Dad, and Amy. It didn't take any urging from anyone for me to walk to where they waited. When I got within a few feet, Mom and Dad opened their arms and I rushed into them, but with my hands in cuffs, I couldn't hug them back. Oh, Morgan, Mom murmured in my ear, what am I going to do with you? I wasn't sure what she meant, and I leaned away and looked at her, my eyebrows bunched. I've been worried sick about you, she said, her eyes damp with unshed tears. I didn't know where you were. I didn't even know if you were alive. I hadn't thought too much about how Mom might be feeling. I'd been preoccupied with my own problems. But now that she stood in front of me, it kind of hit me how hard it must have been for her these last few weeks, especially with Amy locked up in my place. I'm sorry, Mom. I never meant for you to worry. She laughed softly. One day you'll understand that a mother never stops worrying. Well, I said, now you'll know where I am. Any lightheartedness vanished. Yes, she said, but I'd rather you were at home. Then I turned to Dad, and he pulled me close. Morgan, it's so good to see you. I love you so much. Tears filled my eyes. I'm glad to see you too, Dad, and I love you too. After a moment, he released me and put his hands on my shoulders. You'll get through this. You'll be okay. His reassurance helped, but he had no idea if I would be okay. I looked at Mom, and she glanced over my shoulder at the horde filming our interaction, then at Dr. Tasco. Do you know how long you'll be there? She said the word there like it was just summer camp. No, I said, but I feared it would be a long time. Before I'd assaulted an enforcement officer, I'd been sentenced to 6 months. Now who knew how long it would be? And I hadn't noticed any kind of court system where I could defend my actions. Guilty unless proven, well, just guilty. That's how it worked here. I sighed, then turned to Amy. She threw her arms around me, and I pressed my cheek against hers. I'm so glad you got out, I said in her ear so no one else could hear. It's not right what they're doing, she said quietly. What do you mean? Making this big show about getting you and letting me go. I'd assumed this kind of thing happened all the time. It's okay, I said. I can handle it. I had no idea if that was true, but it sounded good. I pulled away and smiled at her. She smiled back and seemed a little less angry, so at least my comment had helped. Time to get going, Dr. Tasco said in the microphone. We have a schedule to keep. I didn't know what schedule he was talking about, but I figured it was the only thing he could come up with to hurry me along. My family gave me one more hug, then the enforcers led me through the parting crowd of reporters and out to a waiting vehicle. They held the door open and helped me inside. They couldn't be too rough with all the media watching. Then they put my seatbelt on me and shut the door. We pulled away from the curb a moment later, just me and the two enforcers who had stayed by my side throughout the whole ordeal. But they weren't my protectors. They were my jailers. I looked at the door and confirmed what I expected. There was no handle. I looked out the window as we drove away from Camp Willowmoss, remembering the last time I'd left. It had been Billy and me, and we'd been on the run. I'd been terrified but exhilarated, full of hope that I would be back to my own world very soon. Now it was completely different. The flame of hope had been extinguished with the same finality as the flame in the lantern when I dropped it in the tunnel. The farther we got from my family and what was familiar, the more the darkness closed in on me. Chapter 50. I leaned my head against the back of the seat and closed my eyes, my shoulders aching from having my arms behind me for so long. I tried to pretend I was just running an errand with Mom, or maybe we were on the way to school. School would be heaven compared to where I was headed now, but when I heard the enforcers start talking in the front seat, I couldn't pretend any more. "Hey, Morgan," one of them said. I cracked my eyes open to see who was talking and saw it was the enforcer in the passenger seat. I'd noticed his name tag said Mills. He looked at me over the seat. "You're going to love it at Camp Stonewater." He grinned. "Lots of scum like you there." Then he laughed and faced the front again. So this would be more like a prison than a fat center. They'd just prettied up the name by calling it Camp Stonewater. Would it all be teenagers like Camp Willowmoss had been? Were there enough bad kids to fill a place like that? Trying to hold back the tears that wanted to break through, I closed my eyes. The last thing I wanted was for these enforcers, who obviously despised me, to see me cry. What seemed like an hour later, we pulled up to a gate. Trying to get a good look at this place, I sat up straighter. A chain-link fence topped with razor wire stretched out in both directions. The guard shack at the entrance was manned by two well-armed enforcers. The driver of the car showed an ID and was waved through. As we went through the gate, despair and hopelessness settled over me like a shroud. We drove to the side of the building and stopped next to a door. Mills got out and opened the door next to me, then reached in and grabbed my upper arm, pulling me out. His partner had gotten out and stood watch next to my door. Once I was out of the car, they each grabbed one of my arms and walked me to the building door. We entered a hallway that looked just like the one at Camp Willowmoss had looked the night Hanson and Dimples had brought me in, but instead of taking me to an office to check me in, they brought me to a room with a table, 3 chairs, and a large mirror. I'd watched enough television to recognize an interrogation room. Mills undid my handcuffs, and I rubbed my wrist to try to restore the circulation, then I glanced toward the mirror. Who was on the other side? Without a word, Mills and his partner left the room. When they shut the door, I heard the click of the lock, so I didn't bother checking to see if I could get out. Where would I go anyway? To the guard shack at the gate? Yeah, I was sure they would let me waltz right out. I sat there, alone, waiting for something to happen. The more time that went by, the more on edge I became, which was certainly their plan. Finally, the door opened and a woman walked in, a bright smile on her face. I'd gotten used to the fake smiles of the F.A.T Center workers, so I hardly registered hers. She looked like she was around 30, and her shoulder-length brown hair was pulled back with a clip. "Good morning, Morgan." She sat in one of the empty chairs across the table from me. "My name's Holly. Can I get you anything? Something to eat or drink?" Since I'd thrown up my breakfast, I was pretty hungry. "Sure." She stood. "Great, I'll be back in a minute." True to her word, a few minutes later she was back with a tray in her hand. She set it in front of me. I stared at the 3 power bars and the glass of water. Several squares of ice floated in the water, making me realize how thirsty I was. I picked up the glass and gulped down half of the water. My stomach rumbled at the sight of the power bars, but as hungry as I was, I worried about eating them on an empty stomach. Vivid memories of the way I'd felt after eating the power bars on an empty stomach filled my mind. The compliance drug had hit me hard, making me feel drunk and out of control, not a feeling I wanted to have in a place like this. "Go ahead, Morgan," Holly said as she motioned to the tray. "They'll take away your hunger." As well as other things, I thought. "I'm okay." I smiled to show that as much as I appreciated the offer, I was still in control of what I put in my body. She slid the tray out of my reach. "Okay, maybe later." My stomach churned painfully. I really wanted to eat just one power bar, but I kept my hands in my lap. "Is there anything else you need?" "I'd like to go to the bathroom." "Of course, follow me." She brought me to a bathroom and waited outside while I went in. It was a small, windowless room with a single toilet and a sink. Remembering the escape I'd made with Billy, I looked at the vent high on the wall. It was too small for me to climb through, assuming I could even get to it. My shoulders slumped. I wouldn't be escaping this place right now. And if I was honest with myself, which I was loath to be, I had to admit that the possibility of escaping this place was unlikely. "You almost done in there?" Holly called through the door. "Just about." A moment later I came out. "We need to get back to the room," she said. "There are some people who would like to talk to you." Seeing how I didn't have a choice, I walked with her back to the room and sat down. "They'll be with you in a little while." She smiled. "Make yourself comfortable." I nodded and she left. I felt self-conscious as I sat there. People had to be watching me from the other side of the glass. After what seemed like a very long time, I pulled the tray closer to me and drank more water. Someone had topped it off while Holly and I were gone. I stared at the power bars as my stomach growled. I imagined biting into one. My mouth watered. To distract myself, I thought about other things: Mom, Dad, Amy, home, Billy. I even stood and paced the room, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the 3 power bars laid out neatly on the tray. I'd been eating 6 per day, 2 at each meal, for several days, and now my body craved the addictive drug that had been cooked into them. Against my better judgment, I picked one up. I turned my back to the mirrored wall. I didn't want them to see my weakness, and pretended to read the packaging. But in reality, I held it close enough to my face to let the scent reach my nose. Something in my brain craved that power bar, and after holding back as long as I could, I ripped open the packaging and took a small bite. The familiar, delicious taste exploded in my mouth, and I gobbled the rest of it down. Somehow, when I had these at each meal, I had been able to manage my desire to eat them, probably because I'd had other food alongside them, making me less hungry and able to think more clearly. Now, however, I was famished. It made it nearly impossible to resist the temptation. I sat down and ignored the mirrored wall and tried to ignore the tray, but the other 2 power bars were just begging to be eaten. After holding out as long as I could, I ate them too, then finished off the glass of water. Chapter 51. Once all the power bars were gone, shame that I hadn't been able to control myself drifted over me like a dense fog, but that was soon replaced by a feeling of carefree indifference. Who cared if I ate them or not? What did it matter? I floated on the feeling of apathy and stared into space. A few minutes later the door opened, and a man in a suit walked in. He reminded me of Dr. Tasco, tall, thin, glasses, and I vaguely wondered if he ran this place. He sat across from me. "Hi, Morgan, I'm Fred." I thought about the man named Fred who had given me a ride in his beat-up old truck. He'd had long gray hair and an unkempt beard, and had even had a couple of missing teeth. This man looked nothing like him. I laughed. "No, you're not." He seemed taken aback. "Actually, I am." I threw my hands up. "Whatever." "We'd like to get you settled, but first we have a few questions for you." I leaned back in my seat. What did I care? Ask away. Are you Morgan Campbell? What kind of a dumb question was that? He wasn't too smart. Hadn't he watched the news from this morning? Duh, I said. He smiled. I'll take that as a yes. I rolled my eyes. Do you have a sister named Amy? I felt kind of sorry for him. Hadn't anyone told him what was going on? Nevertheless, I tried to be patient. Yes. And is your mother named Susanna? This question confused me. My real mother's name was Roxanne, but there had been that other woman who pretended to be my mom. Her name was Susanna. No, I finally said. I don't understand, he said, a look of puzzlement on his face. That was the name of the woman who brought you to Camp Willowmoss, and she said you were her daughter. He paused. Are you saying she's not your mother? No. I was glad I could shed some light on his confusion. She was just pretending to be my mom. Oh, I see. But he still looked confused. Why would she do that? I laughed. Wasn't it obvious? Because I couldn't have my real mom bring me in and say my name was Hannah Jacobs. He seemed to get it now. Oh yeah, that makes sense. He paused. Whose idea was this anyway? I didn't even hesitate. Jack and Danny's. Who are Jack and Danny? I leaned forward like I had a secret. He leaned toward me. When I spoke, it was in a whisper. They don't think the fat centers are a good idea. They want to change everyone's mind about them. He whispered back. Do they belong to a group? I sat back up, and in my normal voice I said, I guess. He sat up too. Do you know what they call themselves? Now I was confused. Jack and Danny. But do they belong to a group? I don't know. Do they ever have meetings with other people? I pictured the room in Jack's house where we met sometimes. They'd called it the meeting room, but I'd never seen anyone besides our little group and the time Susanna had come. No. But you spent time with Jack and Danny? I lived with them. That really got his attention. Where do they live? Later, when I was completely sober and I thought about this conversation, for once I was grateful for my terrible sense of direction. I don't know. What do you mean? You said you lived with them. Where did you live? I really had no idea. Bryn had picked Billy and me up at a high school somewhere near Fox Run, and then she had driven us to Jack's house and I'd been asleep. I had no idea where that was. Even when Susanna had brought me to Camp Willowmoss, I'd been so worried about what would happen, I hadn't paid attention to where I was. I lived with Jack and Danny, I said. He seemed to get a little impatient with my answer. But where did you live? What was the name of the city? I shrugged. It was just at Jack's house. He sighed. Can you tell me what Jack and Danny look like? I described them as best as I could, and he smiled, which made me feel good. Now, he said, you had a friend at Camp Willowmoss. I believe his name was Billy. Is that correct? The mention of Billy caught my attention, and an alarm bell rang somewhere in the deep recesses of my mind, but I couldn't quite grasp the importance of it. Instead, I thought about my friend Billy, and I smiled. Yes. Did he live at Jack's house too? Remembering the disagreements we'd had and how he'd left without saying goodbye, I frowned. For a little while. What do you mean? At first he lived there, but then he left. Where did he go? I don't know. He didn't tell me. He leaned back in his chair and stared at me. Is there anything else you want to tell me? I thought about the camera in my glasses and about the tunnel that would take me back to my world, but I was exhausted and I didn't want to talk anymore. I shook my head. Okay, Morgan. Thank you for answering my questions. I'm tired, I said. Can I take a nap? Of course. Someone will take you to a place where you can rest. He stood then and left the room. My eyelids felt heavy and I let them slide closed. The next thing I knew, someone was shaking me, and when I opened my eyes, I saw Holly standing over me. Wake up, Morgan! I blinked a few times, but still felt groggy. Come with me. I followed her out of the room and to an elevator. It looked just like the one at Camp Willowmoss. Once we were inside, she waved her card in front of the reader and pressed the button for the 5th floor. Moments later, we arrived, and she led me down a hallway, past several doors. Then she stopped in front of one with a number 508 written on it. She waved her card in front of the reader, and I heard it unlock. "This will be your room, Morgan." She opened the door, and we walked inside. It looked quite similar to the room I'd had at Camp Willowmoss. The main difference was the window. Thick, black, vertical bars were built into the opening. The glass was on the outside of the bars. I guess so that breaking the glass would be impossible. Both beds were neatly made. Holly pointed to one of them. "That will be your bed. You can take a nap if you want. I know it's been a busy morning." She gestured toward the closet. "Your things were brought over from Camp Willowmoss." She paused. "Through that door is the bathroom." A bathroom attached to the room? I thought. That was different, too. "Go ahead and rest. I'll be back to talk to you later." Still out of it from the power bars, I nodded, then lay on the bed. Holly left, and I was asleep within minutes. When I woke up, I felt a lot better, until I remembered the questions the man in the suit had asked me. He'd said his name was Fred, which I'd found funny at the time, but now, as I thought about the questions he'd asked, there was nothing funny about them. Obviously, he'd been trying to get information about Jack and Danny's resistance group. I couldn't remember exactly what I told him, but I vaguely remembered him getting frustrated with me. As I thought about how little I actually knew about their group, I felt better. I didn't know enough to help Fred and his people find Jack and Danny. Maybe that's why Jack and Danny had never given me much information. There would be that much less I could give up under questioning. I pushed myself to a sitting position, then went into the bathroom. Except for the bars and the windows, maybe this place would actually be nicer than Camp Willowmoss. After all, with a bathroom just for me, and my roommate, whoever that was, no one would be bullying me to go to the back of the line when it was time to shower. After I checked out the bathroom, I decided to explore the rest of the 5th floor, but when I tried to open the bedroom door, nothing happened. It was then that I realized why the bathroom was attached to the room. Because I wasn't allowed to leave. I was locked in. Chapter 52. I tried the door again to make sure it wasn't just hard to open, but no, it was locked. I went to the window and looked outside. I couldn't see directly below my window because the bars made it impossible to get that close to the glass, but I could see beyond that. From my vantage point, I saw that the chain-link fence topped by razor wire appeared to circle the entire compound. I couldn't see the guard shack, but I knew it was out front. On the other side of the fence stood a small parking lot filled with cars, and beyond that was a field. No houses were in view. I guess no one wanted to live near a prison. As I stared out the window, the familiar feeling of panic and desperation began to creep up my throat. Even if I managed to eventually escape this place, there was no way I could get out within the next 9 days. It would take me at least that long to work out a plan, assuming I even came up with something that would work. No, it was virtually impossible for me to get to the tunnel by November 10th, the date I had left my old world, and the date I believed I would need to make the reverse trip. I slowly turned around and looked at the room that had become my prison. Maybe I should just try to make a break for it when they came to let me out. They had to let me leave my room eventually, right? What did I have to lose? If I succeeded in getting out, then I would have a chance to get back to my world. And if I failed to escape, then I would be back where I was now. Renewed hope began to fill my mind, making me giddy. Full of nervous energy, I tried to think positive thoughts and pictured myself running past the enforcers and out to freedom. I had no idea how I would make it happen. I just had to convince myself that I could make it happen. I couldn't allow myself to think otherwise, or the hopelessness would overwhelm me. I went to the closet and rearranged my things, grateful that at least I had my own clothes. Then I looked over the room again. There was the bed and a desk for me, and a twin to those for my roommate. I wondered if I'd get another queen bee roommate. I really hoped not. I'd had my fill of those. With absolutely nothing to do, I lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling. visualizing myself walking into the tunnel and coming out the other side into my home world. The imagery fueled me with excitement and hope. I heard commotion at the door. Sitting up, I watched the door with anticipation. At the last minute, I turned on the camera on my glasses. I knew I only had a total of 10 hours of recording time, and I'd already used a couple of hours, but I wanted to be ready for anything. A moment later, the door opened, and Holly stood in the doorway. She walked in and closed the door behind her, then sat on the bed opposite me. "Hey there, Morgan. Are you feeling better?" I nodded, even though I was extremely upset with her and everyone else at Camp Stonewater for purposely making me high on the power bars. They'd done it to get information out of me, and it had worked. I felt used, like the only value I had was as a source of information. "Good. I'm glad to hear it." "Sure you are," I thought. "I wanted to talk to you about where we stand." Her friendly manner turned more businesslike. "At this point in time, we've decided to not give you a roommate." I wasn't sure if that was good or bad, but it was certainly interesting. "Okay. The conversation you had with Fred earlier today was helpful, but it wasn't enough." Thrilled to hear that I hadn't given them enough information, I couldn't hold back a smile. Holly obviously picked up on my attitude. "You may think that's good news," she said, "but you need to understand the effect it has on you personally." She sighed. "You see, I've been assigned to get more information from you, and I'd really prefer it if you'd make my job easier by answering my questions as honestly and thoroughly as you can." I laughed. I couldn't help it. Really? She wanted me to make her job easier? Why in the world would I want to do that? She didn't smile. "Morgan, you seem to think this is all just a game, but you have to understand that the people in charge are deadly serious." She leaned forward and stared at me. "Deadly," she repeated. My laughter stopped abruptly and my throat went dry. "What do you mean?" Looking more relaxed, she sat back. "Between you and me, they'll do whatever it takes to keep the status quo. They're well aware of the resistant groups out there that want to change the way the government has chosen to run things, to control things, one might say, and they want to stop those groups. Those groups represent an annoyance that they just don't want to have to deal with anymore." She paused. "They've had enough, Morgan. They want to put a stop to these groups once and for all." "Why are you telling me this?" "That's a very good question, since you've worked with these groups. You'll just go and tell them what we've talked about, right? Then they'll be prepared for whatever's coming." "I guess." "That's where you're wrong, Morgan. I'm convinced that you'll cooperate with me because it will be in your self-interest." She smiled, a look of calm on her face. "You see, Camp Stonewater isn't like the little F.A.T center you came from." Her smile grew. "No, we're just a little different. You may have noticed the extra hardware on the windows, for example." She waved toward the bars covering the glass. "And you may have noticed we didn't give you a hall pass to allow you to leave your room and wander the building at will." I had to agree that I'd noticed those things rather quickly. "You have no freedom here, Morgan. None. And it will stay that way as long as you're uncooperative." I felt my enthusiasm about the chance to escape slipping away. How could I even attempt an escape if I never left this room? "What I'm proposing," she said, "is a trade-off, a deal, if you will." She stared at me. "You tell me what you know, and we'll let you mingle with the general population." That was the deal? Letting me be around a bunch of potential bullies? No thanks. "You'll also be given other privileges that are more standard for our other inmates." Inmate, that's what I was considered. But it made sense, seeing as this was a prison. "What kinds of privileges?" I asked. "Regular meals, for example." Eating regularly was a privilege? What would I get in the meantime? I was almost afraid to ask. Almost, but not completely. "What if I say no? I won't get any food?" "Your basic needs will be met." "What does that mean?" "You'll receive several power bars per day, but that's all." There was no way the sort of thing would happen in my world. This was cruel and unusual punishment. The only food I would get was drug-laced, government-approved power bars. "You do know I'm just 16, right?" She smiled. That's why we're giving you this opportunity to cooperate. What if I was older, like an adult? She pursed her lips. In that case, we might be a little more harsh, shall we say. This was getting off easy? She watched me for a moment, then stood. I can see you're undecided. You take some time to think this over, and I'll be back in a little while. Then she waved her card in front of the reader beside the door, opened the door, and left. Chapter 53. Stunned by our conversation, I stared at the closed door. Unless I agreed to cooperate by giving them all the information I had so they could stop all resistant activity by Jack and Danny's group, they would keep me in a drug-induced haze. But what if I refused to eat the power bars? Then what would they do? Let me starve to death? I turned off the camera, glad I'd turned it on before Holly had arrived. Then I thought about Jack and Danny. Had they sent me to Camp Willowmoss knowing the contact lenses wouldn't trick the retinal scanner? Or had they really believed they would work? How much allegiance did I owe them? I believed in what they were doing, but was I willing to risk myself for them? What would the benefit be to me if I told all? I would get to mingle with the rest of the inmates? How was that a good thing? How serious was the government in wanting to find the resistance groups? How far were they really willing to go? I paced the small room, my thoughts flying in a million different directions. I stopped next to the window and stared at the beautiful fall day. It was November 1st, 9 days until my deadline. If I had any hope of getting to the tunnel, and the chances seemed slimmer by the minute, I had to stay focused on my first priority, getting out. And what would help me to get out? That's what I needed to consider. I thought about Amy and my brothers, as well as Mom and Dad. Even if I made it back to my world, they would still be here. Did I want to jeopardize the groups that could possibly change things? And what if I was stuck in this world? Did I want to jeopardize the groups that could potentially make life better for me? I rubbed my forehead as a headache began growing in my skull. I lay on the bed and closed my eyes, trying to think positive thoughts, but my headache not only grew stronger, I also started to feel nauseated. It was the power bars. I was having withdrawal symptoms after having those 3 power bars earlier. Nothing would help me feel better except more power bars, which I desperately wanted to stay away from. Fury at Holly and the people she worked for welled up inside me, giving me strength. I would not give them any information that would help them defeat the people fighting against them. The people in the resistance were already facing difficult odds fighting the government, and those who wanted to keep things exactly as they were. And those in charge were trying to take even greater control with the drug-laced power bars. How long before they distributed those power bars to the general public? And the general public would have no idea what was happening until it was too late. The door clicked and Holly walked in. I shot up to a sitting position, but then a wave of dizziness crashed over me and I leaned forward, putting my head between my knees. Holly was silent as I sat there, waiting for the dizziness to subside. While my head hung down, I fiddled with my glasses, turning on the camera. After a minute, the dizziness faded, and I slowly lifted my head and looked at her. "Are you feeling okay, Morgan?" "Not really." I almost said that she shouldn't be surprised, but I didn't want to give away the fact that I knew the power bars had an addictive drug in them. She sat on the bed across from me. "I'm sorry to hear that." "No, you're not," I thought. "Have you come to a decision?" she asked. "Yes." Her eyebrows went up. "And?" "I'm not going to tell you anything." She smiled. I was afraid of that. Then why was she smiling? That really creeped me out. "You may want to reconsider, Morgan. You're going to be here for a very long time. If you cooperate, your stay could be much more pleasant." That was a loaded statement. Could be much more pleasant? No guarantees there, and much more pleasant. But that didn't mean it would actually be pleasant. And how did I even know she would keep her word if I did cooperate? I shook my head. "No." She sighed and stood up. "Have it your way." Then she left the room. My heart pounded. The last time I'd heard those words, I'd been in the gym at Camp Willowmoss ignoring Austin's command to go faster on the elliptical, and he'd brought in a pair of enforcers, including Hansen, to discipline me for not obeying Austin. Now that had been less than pleasant. Moments later, Holly was back. She had 2 enforcers and a woman in a lab coat with her. Panic flooded me, and I jumped up, ready to flee. Frantically sizing up the situation, I looked for a means of escape, but the 4 people in front of me completely blocked the door. The room wasn't very big to begin with, but with them and me in the space, there was no room to maneuver. But I had to try. I couldn't just stand there and take whatever they were about to dish out. I bolted to the right, but one of the enforcers stepped into my path, the one named Mills. With adrenaline pumping through me, I shoved him, but he hardly moved. Instead, he grabbed one of my wrists and twisted my arm behind my back, bringing me to my knees. "That hurts!" I cried out. "Let go!" "Morgan," Holly said in a calm voice, "remember that you wanted this." I wanted to scratch her eyes out and see how calm she felt about that. Then something cold and metallic pressed against my neck, and I immediately knew what it was. I tried to brace myself for the shock, but by the time I registered that they'd put a stun gun to my neck, I was already collapsing to the ground. The enforcers lifted me from the floor and dropped me onto the bed, then turned my head so that the back of my neck was exposed. I was paralyzed, but I could still feel the cold wetness of something being wiped across my neck, then a pinprick, and a moment later, numbness. I thought maybe they were done with whatever they were doing, but then I felt pressure as something was injected into the base of my skull. My eyes widened in horror as I stared at the wall. What did they just do to me? Fingers smoothed something against my skin. "You'll be fine, Morgan," Holly said in a soothing voice. The door opened, then closed, and all was silent. When the effects of the taser wore off, I reached for the back of my neck. A strip of bandage was taped to the place where someone, I assumed the woman in the lab coat, had inserted something under my skin. I pulled the bandage off and grimaced. The spot was tender to the touch. Even so, I pressed the area, trying to tell what they'd done. I felt a small lump, but that told me nothing. The lump was bigger than the one on my arm, so what was it for? The one on my arm was to track my whereabouts. What did this one do? Chapter 54. Anxious about what kind of technology they put into my body, I slowly sat up. I remembered to turn off the camera, although I was beginning to wonder if it even mattered at this point. Was anyone getting the video of what was happening? Did anyone care? I looked around and saw a tray sitting on my desk. A tray with 6 power bars and an empty paper cup. I took the paper cup and went into the bathroom, filling it with tap water. I gulped it down, then filled it again and drank that too. I set the cup on the small counter and went to the window, staring outside as I tried to pretend 6 power bars were not within my grasp. Nausea welled up inside me, but I stared defiantly out the window. I would hold out for as long as I could. I had to. Instead, I thought about what Holly had said earlier, how the people in charge were deadly serious. Deadly, she'd repeated. What had she meant by that? Were they willing to kill for what they wanted? Were they willing to kill me if I didn't cooperate? Would whatever they inserted into my neck kill me? I reached up and touched the lump again. Was it possible to get it out? All I felt was a tiny hole where the woman had done the insertion, too small for me to dig around and pull the object out. I went back into the bathroom to see if there was anything I could use to cut it out. After all, Billy and I had managed to get the chips out of our arms before. Then again, we'd taken them out of each other, not out of ourselves. The bathroom held a metal toilet, a sink bolted to the wall with a mirror-like wall hanging above it, and a shower. Nothing that I could use to get the chip, or whatever it was, out, and nothing I could use as a weapon. Then I searched the bedroom, but found nothing useful there either. I sat on the bed and felt the lump again. It was about the size of a bean, and just as hard. The more I pressed on the spot, the more it hurt. I held my fingers against it and thought about the deal Holly had offered me. If I told her what I knew, she would let me out of this room. I had no desire to mingle with the other inmates, but if I couldn't leave this room, I'd have zero chance of escaping. I set my hands in my lap and tried not to think about what might be lurking at the base of my skull. Then my thoughts went to the power bar sitting on the tray mere feet away. My gaze drifted over to them, but I turned my head and looked the other way. Maybe I should flush them down the toilet. Then eating them wouldn't be an option. But just the thought of doing that made my head pound. I pressed the heels of my hands against my forehead, trying to massage away the pain, but the pain stubbornly refused to leave. Then the nausea hit me again. I curled up on my bed, trying to will away my misery, but either my will was too weak, or my body's reaction was out of control. Recalling how eating a power bar had eased the symptoms the last time this had happened, I considered that solution. "I'll only eat half a bar," I bargained with myself. "Just enough to make the symptoms go away, but that's all." Convinced I had no other choice, I got off the bed and walked over to the desk. I placed my hands on either side of the tray and leaned forward, studying the bars. Whoever had set the tray on the desk had arranged the bars in a perfectly symmetrical formation, spacing them evenly. I picked up the one on the far left and snapped it in half. The scent wafted to my nose and my mouth watered in anticipation. Using extreme self-control, I set one half back on the tray and picked up the other 5 bars, then put the 5 1/2 bars in my closet under my clothes. Maybe if they weren't visible, I'd be less tempted to eat them. I picked up the half bar, carried it to my bed, and sat down. I slowly unwrapped the paper, and when it was out of the packaging, I ate the entire thing, savoring each bite. When it was gone, I lay on my bed and waited to see if my withdrawal symptoms would go away. After a little while they did, and I felt good that I had only eaten half a bar. The appetite suppressant did a pretty good job of assuaging my hunger. As much as I wanted the other half of the bar, and I couldn't keep from picturing it tucked under my clothes, I resisted the urge to get up and eat it. Instead, now that I didn't feel sick, I thought about Holly's deal. I already knew what would happen if I refused to help her. I would be in this room, just me and the power bars, for days and weeks and months. But what would happen if I accepted the deal? If I told her what I knew? I mentally listed the possibilities. I would be able to leave this room. I would have a chance to scope this place out and think of a way to escape. I would be able to eat something other than just power bars. There was a flip side to that. What if the information led to Jack and Danny's capture? What would these people do to them? What if they made Jack and Danny confess what they knew? They had to know much more than I did, and what they knew would most likely hurt other resistance groups. So it wouldn't just be Jack and Danny who would be stopped, but potentially other resistance groups as well, assuming Jack and Danny weren't killed outright. Then I considered what information I actually had. I knew what Jack and Danny looked like. I knew the names of the other people living at Jack's house. I knew what Jack and Danny's ultimate goal was, to change the hearts and minds of the people, which would lead to changing the laws regarding the government's control over everyone's weight. But I didn't know where they lived, and I didn't think I could figure it out. I was torn. This was the hardest decision I'd ever had to make. What did the pledge say? That I would strive to put the good of all above the desires of one? But I didn't believe that, right? I just said the words because I had to. If I were to put my own desires first, I'd take the deal in a heartbeat. Not able to think about it anymore, I closed my eyes. Chapter 55. When I next woke, it was dark outside. The lights were still on in my room, so evidently it wasn't time for lights out yet, but I had no idea what time it was. At this time of year, it got dark pretty early, so it could have been early evening. In any case, I was really hungry and immediately thought of the power bar stashed in the closet. Without much thought, I rushed to the closet and pulled out a full bar, then stopped and looked at it before deciding I wasn't willing to starve to death. I ripped it open and wolfed it down, then went into the bathroom and kept filling the paper cup with water, drinking it until I was so full that I couldn't drink another drop. At least I wouldn't be tempted to eat another power bar for a while. I hoped that keeping the drug consumption to a minimum would also minimize the effect of the drugs, and maybe drinking lots of water would dilute the effect as well. I looked out the window, straining to see anything. The lights in the parking lot were on, and there were still about a dozen cars parked there, but no one was coming or going. I trudged back to the bed and sat down, feeling more bored than I had in ages. What I wouldn't give for a book! I wouldn't even mind a boring textbook at that point, anything to keep my mind occupied. I decided to do some exercises. No point in sitting around the entire time, so I did some push-ups, sit-ups, jumping jacks. I even ran in place. With no one forcing me to do it, I enjoyed moving my body and didn't mind working up a sweat. Eventually, the lights turned off and I couldn't see anything. I went back to the window and stared outside. A little while later, a few people appeared in the lamplight as they walked to their cars, got in, and drove away. I wondered if Holly was among them, and I hated her with a loathing I'd never felt before. When it seemed no one else was going to leave, I made my way to the bathroom and got ready for bed, then slipped inside the covers and tried to sleep. I'd slept a lot that day, which made it harder to fall asleep, so I occupied my mind with a memory of escaping with Billy and how frightening yet exhilarating that had been. As I thought about Billy, I wished I'd listened to him about the risk I was taking in going back into the lion's den. He tried to warn me that the chances of success were low. Had it been worth it? Well, Amy was free, and that had been my main motivator, so I didn't completely regret my choice. I thought about how difficult it was for Amy in Camp Willowmoss, how depressed she'd been, how people had bullied her, and how Austin had tried to recruit her to be his special friend. Yes, it was good that I was able to get her out of there, even though I found myself here now. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, the sun was streaming in through the window, making funny shadows on the carpet because of the bars partially blocking the light. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, and immediately noticed that the tray from the day before had been replaced by a new one. I could tell it was new because there was a new paper cup, and more power bars. I threw back the covers and walked over to the desk, examining the offering. 9 power bars were set in groupings of 3, I guess to show that they were meant to be 3 per meal. I closed my eyes and tried to stay focused on what was important, staying in control of my mind. I'd have no choice but to eat some of the power bars, but not all 9. I would be high as a kite if I ate all of those. As I considered the state these people wanted me to be in, my heart raced. They wanted me to be stoned on their drugs, dependent on them for more power bars. Well, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I made sure the 4.5 power bars were still hidden under my clothes. Then I took the 9 and brought them to the bathroom. One by one, I unwrapped them, broke them into smaller pieces, then flushed them down the toilet. When all 9 were gone, liberation flowed over me. I would have to ration the 4.5 bars in my closet, but I didn't have to worry about losing my self-control and eating too many bars in one day. I took a shower, the water was barely warm, and felt even better. I ate the half power bar and drank lots of water, then lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling. I won't let these people win, I thought. The day dragged by. Holly never came to see if I changed my mind, and I began to worry, just a little. What if I had changed my mind? How long would she make me wait? I had just 8 days before my deadline to reach the tunnel. If I decided to cooperate, which I hadn't yet decided, then I needed to get out of there as soon as possible so I would have time to see how everything was laid out and to develop a plan. By the time the lights went out, I'd eaten 3 of the 4 remaining power bars, but I'd made sure to drink lots of water each time. I felt pretty good. I wasn't having withdrawal symptoms, and I still had control of my mind. The next 2 days passed with no contact from anyone, although someone came into my room during the night to deliver the power bars each morning. My anxiety notched up higher and higher. I followed the same routine: keep 3 power bars for the day and flush the rest down the toilet. When I woke up the next morning, something was different. Chapter 56. Just like the past few mornings, the first place I looked when I woke up was the desk. Today, however, there was no tray. I jumped out of bed and hurried over to the desk to make sure the tray just hadn't been placed somewhere different. It wasn't on the floor or anywhere else I looked, and I looked everywhere, including the closet. No one had brought me any food. Agitation grew within me. I didn't have any power bars put aside, and I was really hungry. Did they know I hadn't been eating them? Or did they think I had and expected that I would soon be in a desperate state of withdrawal? Now I was extremely glad that I'd only eaten the minimum to keep myself going. Otherwise, I would be in dire straits now. Trying to ignore the gnawing in my stomach, I did some stretches, then showered. While staring out the window, I heard the lock on the door click. I spun around and stared at the door as my heart slammed against my ribs. It had been 4 days since anyone had come to see me. The last interaction I'd had was when Holly and her friends had injected the object into the base of my skull. Remembering that terrifying experience now, my anxiety skyrocketed as my eyes stayed glued to the door. A moment later, Holly walked in. She smiled as if we were old friends. Either she was a very good actress or she was a sociopath who had no conscience. I assumed it was the latter. "Good morning, Morgan. I'm glad to see you up and around." Was she surprised that I wasn't writhing in agony on the floor, desperate for some power bars? I just looked at her, not sure what she had planned for me, and tried not to think about the horrors she could inflict. "Are you hungry?" she asked. I was starving, but I wasn't sure what the right answer was, so I settled on, "I guess." Her smile grew. "Good! I have a special treat for you today." The volume of adrenaline pumping through my body increased, but I was frozen in place. Holly must have sensed my fear because she held her hands out in an offering of peace. "Don't worry, Morgan. This will be fun." Her idea of fun and mine were probably very different, but I tried to calm down nonetheless. "Follow me," she said. "I'm going to take you on a tour." That didn't sound too bad, depending on where her tour ended, and I didn't think she was giving me a choice, so I walked toward her, then followed her down the hall to the bank of elevators. She waved her card in front of the reader, and a moment later we were headed down. The doors opened onto a medium-sized cafeteria. It was smaller than the one at Camp Willowmoss, which made me think there were fewer people at this prison than at the F.A.T Center. No one was sitting at the tables, although there were a few kids cleaning up. Evidently, breakfast was over. "Come sit over here." Holly led me to a nearby table. I sat down, and she sat beside me. A moment later, a woman brought a tray to our table and set it in front of me. My mouth watered at the sight of the veggie omelet and fresh fruit. "Go ahead, Morgan, eat." She didn't have to ask me twice. I picked up the fork. I doubted I would have gotten a real fork if Holly hadn't been sitting right next to me, and began eating. I'd had nothing but power bars for days, and the explosion of flavor in my mouth was exquisite. It didn't take long to eat the entire thing, and when I was done, Holly handed me 2 power bars. "You're probably wanting these about now, am I right?" I glanced at the bars. I didn't crave them as powerfully as I had feared. I couldn't deny that I wanted them, but not in the way Holly probably expected. "That's okay," I said. "I'm full." Her eyebrows shot up. Then they settled back into place, and she smiled tightly. "Are you sure?" She kind of waved them in front of me like she was tempting me. My eyes followed the movement of the bars, but I held firm. "Yeah, I'm good." "Okay." She set the bars down. "Let's move on, shall we?" She took me to a room next to the cafeteria. "This is the recreation area." I looked on with astonishment. Kids were hitting a ball back and forth across a ping-pong table. Other kids were playing air hockey, and yet other kids sat around talking to each other. Most of them ignored me, but some cut their eyes in my direction before looking away. Several enforcers stood around watching me, including Mills, the man who had brought me here and told me I was scum. My eyes met his, and he stared back. Something about him reminded me of Hanson, and I felt a small shiver as I looked at him leaning casually against the wall, his eyes on me. "Doesn't this look like fun?" Holly asked, gesturing around the room. I had to admit that it looked way more fun than what I'd been doing for the last few days, namely, sitting around my room trying not to die of boredom. And these kids didn't even look mean. Were they all prisoners like me? What had they done? "Well, Morgan?" "What?" Would you like to spend your days here, or do you prefer to be in your room? Of course I'd rather be in this game room, I thought, but I wasn't an idiot. I knew what the trade-off would be. Sure, it looks like fun. She smiled. That's what I thought you'd say. She motioned for me to follow her. We stopped in the hallway just outside the rec room. You can earn the privilege of being in that room, Morgan. It's up to you. I decided to play dumb. What do you mean? Her smile never wavered. If you cooperate with us and answer our questions, then you will have the privilege of spending your days in the recreation room with the others. So you're saying I'd have to snitch on my friends, right? Now her smile did waver. I wouldn't categorize it that way. But that's what I'd be doing, I said, telling you all about them, which could hurt them. I don't know why you'd think it would hurt them. We just want to talk to them, negotiate, come to some sort of understanding. Her smile grew. We want peace. Did she think I'd forgotten what she'd said on the day I was brought here? That the people in power were deadly serious about putting an end to the resistance? I couldn't help it. I laughed. The smile on her face vanished. What do you find funny about this? I stifled the laughter. I guess I've just been on my own so long that I've gone a little stir-crazy. She smiled like she understood. Yes, I can imagine. Now what do you think? Do you want to earn the privilege of being in the rec room? I hesitated. I really wanted to be able to spend my days hanging out with these kids. They looked like they were having so much fun. This was nothing like Camp Willowmoss. But was I willing to be a snitch to make it happen? Was I willing to put the whole resistance in jeopardy just to satisfy my own desires? I pictured Amy and my brothers. As long as the status quo held, they would be in danger of being taken to a F.A.T center and held against their will. And what about Dad? When I'd seen him on the day I was moved here, he'd looked beaten down, not strong and vigorous like a man who had just spent months getting healthy. This world needed the opposing voices of the resistance groups. How else would there be any hope of change? Then I considered the ticking clock, and that in 5 days the time for me to reach the tunnel would run out. Even if I cooperated, was there any hope I would be able to escape this place in time? And if I failed and was stuck in this world, and I helped the people here defeat the resistance groups, I would end up suffering as well. Before I realized I'd done it, I shook my head. My decision had been made. I couldn't help Holly and her bosses, even if it meant putting my own future in jeopardy. Her eyes narrowed. Are you sure about this, Morgan? I wasn't sure about anything. She must have sensed my ambivalence because she grabbed my arm and tugged me forward. Let's go. I didn't know where she was taking me, but fresh fear filled my gut. A few minutes later, we were back on my floor, and she walked me to my room. She opened the door and motioned for me to enter. I walked in and turned to look at her. I'll give you one last chance to decide, Morgan. She looked at the floor and sighed, then she looked at me. Please decide wisely. Then she left, and I heard the click of the lock. Emotionally spent, I sank onto my bed and put my head into my hands. With nothing to do but think, my mind wandered from one option to the other until I couldn't think about it anymore. I lay down and closed my eyes and apparently fell asleep, because when I opened my eyes, I saw a tray on my desk. I pushed myself off of my bed and went to check it out. 6 power bars were laid out in a neat row. Demoralized, I stared at the bars, hating them, yet craving them. Finally, I picked up 4 of them and flushed them down the toilet, then came back to the tray and ate one of the 2 remaining bars, saving the other one for later. As had become my habit, I went to the window and stared outside. The small parking lot was full, but there was no activity just then. I spent the rest of the day doing a lot of thinking. Holly had said she would give me one more chance to decide, and I didn't know when she'd come back to find out my answer. I needed to decide soon. As the afternoon turned to evening and no one came, I began to wonder how long she would give me to think about it. Eventually the lights went out and I went to bed, but I still wasn't completely certain what I should do. The next morning I woke to 9 new power bars on the tray, which told me, if the pattern held, that no one would be coming that day. I followed my usual routine, flushing all but 3 bars and rationing those 3 to keep me going through the day. I spent some time exercising, but continually thought about Holly's offer. As each hour passed, the possibility of making my tunnel deadline became less and less likely. It was now 4 days until the clock ran out, and as I thought about being stuck in this world for the rest of my life, I became more and more agitated. Maybe I should take her offer and hope for the best, I thought as I stared out the window. But what about Amy and the boys, Mom and Dad? What kind of society will I be condemning them to? If the resistance groups are stamped out, who will speak up for the helpless citizens who are tasered and dragged out of their homes to be locked up in F.A.T centers? No one, that's who. When the lights went out, I was exhausted and I fell right to sleep. That night I had a vivid dream. Amy and I were playing hide and seek with our brothers out in the yard when a vehicle pulled up to the house. Dimples and Hanson, the same 2 men who had dragged me out of my house, raced up to the door and burst inside, not even bothering to knock. A few minutes later, they dragged both Mom and Dad out of the house and into the car. After they tossed them into the back seat, Hanson came to me, and with a sneer he said, "I'm coming for you next, Morgan. Then your brothers and sister will be sent to a group home and parceled out to strangers, and you'll never see them again." Then he laughed as he got into his car and drove away with Mom and Dad in the back. I woke with tears in my eyes and a dark feeling in my soul. The dream was a nightmare, but a nightmare that could easily come true, and I was helpless to stop it. The only way to stop something like that was to do everything within my power to help the resistance groups, which meant that under no circumstances could I give Holly any information. When I sat up and looked at the desk, I saw that the tray was absent, and deep within my gut, I knew today was going to be a very important day. Chapter 57. I showered quickly, and when I heard the lock on the door click, I turned the camera on, hoping there was still enough juice in the batteries to record what was about to happen. "Hello, Morgan," Holly said as she opened the door. She wasn't smiling. "Hi." I stood next to the window, afraid to move any closer to whatever hell Holly had in store for me. "I hope you've had enough time to make a wise decision." 100% certain of my decision now, no wavering, I nodded. The feelings I had in my dream were very real, and I experienced them now. "Good," she said. Then, perhaps expecting my answer to be that I would help them, she smiled. "What did you decide?" "I'd prefer to stay in this room," I said. Anger flickered across her face, but her features quickly smoothed out. "It's a no, then." My heart pounding wildly, I nodded. She sighed. "As you wish." Then she left the room, and the door locked with a click. Overwhelming foreboding washed over me, and it was suddenly hard to breathe. My mind screamed, "Now what? Now what? Now what?" My worst fears were realized moments later when Holly came back with 2 enforcers, including Mills. They were large men, tall and muscular. I didn't have a chance against them. They strode directly to me, and while Mills held my arms behind my back, the other enforcer put zip ties around my wrists, tightening them uncomfortably. Then they each grabbed one of my upper arms and led me out of the room. A few minutes later, I was back in the interrogation room where I'd been on the day I'd arrived. That was nearly a week before, but the moment I entered the room, it was as if it had just happened. Mills and his partner sat me in a chair, leaving my hands bound, then left the room. I was alone, although I knew there must be people on the other side of the mirrored wall. I wondered who was there, then forced myself not to care. I had to stay focused on the task at hand, keeping any information I had to myself. They left me there for a long time. It felt like hours, though it was more likely less than that. Finally, Holly and the man who'd called himself Fred came into the room with Mills behind them. Holly set a small case on the table as she and Fred sat across from me. Mills stood against one wall. "I was hoping I wouldn't have to talk to you again, Morgan," Fred said. So was I, but I kept silent. My shoulders were sore from being pulled behind my back, and my wrists ached from the too tight restraints. He sighed, like this meeting was an inconvenience for him. "I suppose we ought to get started." He looked at Holly. "Are you ready?" She opened the case and pulled out a device that looked like a smartphone. She set it on the table. Yes. "Morgan," Fred began, "we know you've been involved with at least one resistance group. We are very interested to know where they are." He paused, letting that sink in. I met his gaze, determined not to tell them anything, not that I knew that much, but I was afraid of saying anything for fear they could use it to find Jack and Danny's group. "We know about the man who invited you into his home when you were being chased by enforcers. His name was Tyler." I flashed back to the night Billy and I had been on the motorcycle, chased by several enforcers. Tyler had waved us into his garage into what we thought was safety, but it turned out to be a ploy to get the reward money. "It was after that," Fred continued, "that you met up with Jack and Danny's group." He was correct, but I tried to put on my poker face. I didn't want to so much as acknowledge what they obviously already knew. He stared at me. "Is that correct?" I stared back, my lips clamped shut. He sighed, then looked at Holly and nodded once. She picked up the small device in front of her and tapped the screen. Excruciating pain shot down my back and into my head, and I knew the object they'd inserted into the base of my skull was the cause of it. I screamed in pain and writhed in my chair, slipping out of it and falling to the floor. A moment later, the pain vanished, and I struggled to catch my breath. My glasses had fallen off of my face, but I couldn't pick them up with my hands bound. Strong hands pulled me up from the floor and set me back in the chair. I looked up and saw Mills standing over me, expressionless. He reached down and picked up my glasses, then placed them back on my face before going back to stand against the wall. My eyes were wet with tears as I looked at Holly and Fred. How could they live with themselves? They were monsters. "Let's try again," Fred calmly said. "Did you meet up with Jack and Danny's group after you got away from Tyler?" I'd gotten my breathing under control, but I was so furious at these people for what they were doing that I couldn't bring myself to speak. But when I saw Holly pick up her device and bring her finger close to the screen, I shouted, "Yes!" Both of them smiled. I felt ashamed. "How did you know to call them?" Fred asked. I thought about Mrs. Duncan, the woman who had so generously given Billy and me her son's motorcycle. She'd just met us and had trusted us completely. She'd been the one to give us the phone numbers for Jack and Danny. My eyes were wide as I ricocheted between Holly's finger poised above her small device and Fred. He looked at me expectantly. As I hesitated, Holly's finger dropped ever closer to the screen. When she nearly touched it, I called out, "Wait!" Her finger stopped, but it was way too close to the screen for comfort. "Yes?" Fred asked. "A woman we met." Shame dripped over me like acid. I hated myself for being so weak. "She gave us the number to call." "Who is this woman?" Fred asked. "Where did you meet her?" I couldn't give them Mrs. Duncan's name. She was just a sweet old lady. Perhaps I could tell them enough to get them to move on without having to give her up. "It was just this old lady Billy and I came across when we were on the run." "And she just," he waved his hands in the air, "randomly handed you a phone number?" "She recognized us and knew we had escaped Camp Willowmoss. She just wanted to help." Fred glanced at Holly, then he looked back at me. "So this woman not only is part of the resistance groups, but she harbored fugitives?" Oh crap, I hadn't thought of it like that. "What is her name?" Fred asked. "I don't know. She didn't tell us." Fred's eyes cut to Holly, who tapped the screen. I screamed in agony and slid to the floor. "I don't know! I don't know! I don't know!" The pain abruptly ended. When Mills put his hands on my arms to help me up, I recoiled at his touch. How could he stand to watch this? He ignored my reaction and effortlessly lifted me from the floor and set me back in the chair. I ignored him and focused on breathing. Fred stared at me. "What happened when you called the number?" They believe me, I thought. They believe I don't know Mrs. Duncan's name. It was a small victory, but it buoyed me up. Then I thought about the answer to his next question. Bryn had picked us up and driven us to Jack's house. This was the dangerous part of the questioning, the part that could lead them right to Jack and Danny. "I didn't actually call," I said. "Billy did." Fred sighed. "And what happened after Billy called the number?" "We were told to go outside and walk down the street." Where did you call from? I glanced at Holly and her finger, then looked at Fred. A high school. What high school? I don't know the name of it. It was just the first one we saw. He seemed to accept that. Did you use the phone in the office? I felt really uncomfortable with how specific his questions were getting. Eventually, he'd ask one that I would be extremely reluctant to answer. No, Billy used some random girl's cell phone. What happened after you left the high school and started walking down the street? I hesitated, but saw Holly's finger descending toward the device. I quickly spoke up. A few minutes later, a girl picked us up in her car. A small smile lifted Fred's lips, but then he wiped it away. Where did this girl take you? My heart pounded as I tried to think of a good answer, but only the truth came to my mind. Morgan? Fred said, warning clear in his voice. I closed my eyes. She took us to Jack's house. When I opened my eyes, Fred was smiling, and this time he didn't try to hide it. Holly was smiling too. Very good, Fred said. I felt the opposite of very good. I felt horrible for giving them as much information as I had. Now, he said, obviously pleased with the way things were going, where exactly does Jack live? I shook my head. I don't know. I fell asleep while she drove, and when I woke up, we were in the garage. His smile faded. Surely you spent time outdoors while you were there. I was so happy that I couldn't tell them where Jack lived. No, they didn't let us go outside. What is the name of the girl who brought you there? Oh, no. Maybe they would believe me if I claimed ignorance. I don't know. Just some girl who picked us up and dropped us off. Are you sure about that, Morgan? Yes. He sneered. I don't believe you. Searing pain blew through my head and shot down my spine. I thought I was going to explode from the inside. Screaming in agony, I arched my back, but as I slid to the floor, strong hands held me in place on the chair. I squeezed my eyes closed and used every ounce of my will to endure the pain. Finally, it stopped, and I gasped for breath. Let's try this again, Fred said. Who was the girl who picked you up? I couldn't take it any longer. Their torture had broken me. I couldn't fight them anymore. Her name is Bryn, I whispered. She's a student at the high school. What's her last name? I don't know. I watched Holly's finger move closer to the device, and I began to sob and scream. I don't know! I don't know! I would tell you if I knew! Holly's finger moved from the device. What is Jack's last name? Tears streamed down my face and snot dripped from my nose. I don't know. I don't know anything else, I swear. Fred abruptly stood and motioned for Holly to follow him. She slipped the device back in its case and followed him out of the room, taking the device with her. Now that I knew what the object in my head could do, I felt extremely vulnerable. Someone could press that button at any moment, sending me into throes of agony, maybe even kill me. I stared at the table and tried not to think about what information I'd just given them. I just wanted to blank it all out. Waiting to see what fresh hell was in store for me, I sat there. A short time later, Holly came back in the room. Just the sight of her sent tremors of fear coursing through me. The woman was evil, pure and simple. You did okay, Morgan. She sat across from me. She didn't have the device with her. Relief cascaded over me. They must be done with their questions. We still need your help, though. A wave of dread rippled through me. Tomorrow you're going on a little field trip. You're going to help us find Bryn. She smiled. I know you'll be eager to cooperate. We'll leave first thing in the morning, so make sure you're ready. I was too frightened to speak. She looked at the enforcer who stood against the wall. Mills, undo her hands. He did as he was told, and I rubbed my wrists and rolled my shoulders, then wiped the tears from my eyes. Time to go back to your room, Morgan, Holly said as she stood. As we went back to my room, I didn't speak. I had been defeated by Holly and the people in this world. All hope had been crushed. We reached my room/jail cell, and Holly led me inside. Be ready in the morning, Morgan. Then she left, locking me in. I went to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, and my eyes were dull with despair. I remembered the camera was running, and I spoke into the mirror. I'm so sorry I wasn't stronger. Tears of shame filled my eyes, and I reached up and turned off the camera. I set the glasses on the counter and washed my face. Then I stretched out on my bed and closed my eyes. I had the world's worst headache, obviously due to the object at the base of my skull. I reached back and felt the bean-shaped object, wanting to dig it out with my bare hands, but I couldn't do it without the proper tools. Anyway, even if I did somehow get it out, they would just put another one in. Instead, I imagined how the next day would go. We would go into the high school and walk among the kids. Holly would most certainly be next to me with her finger over the torture device, ready to press it if I so much as looked in the wrong direction. Chapter 58. The next morning I woke early. I'd slept horribly, tossing and turning all night in anticipation of what the day would bring. In the middle of the night, when it was darkest, I couldn't stop the thought that this was it. I was stuck in this world forever. There was no way for me to reach the tunnel in time. The only time I'd been out of my room was when Holly had accompanied me, and now that I knew about the torture device, I had zero doubt that she had complete control over me. As promised, Holly appeared at my door first thing that morning. I'd had time to shower and eat one of the power bars that had been left for me, but only one. I was so stressed that I'd hardly been able to eat that, but I managed to keep it down. I wore my glasses as I'd done every day, never knowing when I might need to record something, although it all seemed pointless now. "Good morning, Morgan." Holly seemed extra cheerful. I, on the other hand, felt lifeless and dull. Hope is what had kept me going, and now it was gone, crushed, snuffed out. I would do what I could to protect Bryn, but now I knew my breaking point. So did Holly. "Let's get going," she said. "We have a lot to do today." I followed her out of the room, and she took me to the first floor. Mills was waiting for us. I glanced at him and felt physically sick. He was as much of a monster as Fred and Holly. He'd stood by and done nothing to help me when I was being tortured. Not only that, he'd held me in the chair during the torture. He didn't even acknowledge me as he held the door open for us. An empty car sat just outside the door. Mills held the back door open, and Holly motioned for me to get in. I did, and Holly got in next to me. Mills climbed behind the wheel, and we set off. "We'll start in the parking lot where you and Billy got away from Tyler," Holly said. "We won't be there for a while, though." I rested my head on the seat back, trying to pretend I was on my way somewhere fun, like a movie or shopping, but the smells in the car made it hard to immerse myself in that fantasy. There was a slight odor of vomit, probably from some poor person who had recently been hauled out of their house. There was also an underlying scent of fear. Maybe that was emanating from me, but I still sensed it. Eventually, we turned into a parking lot. It was mid-morning, and there were lots of cars in activity. "Where did you go once you got away from Tyler?" Holly asked. I didn't have a choice. For my own survival, I had to cooperate. "We ran in that direction," I said, as I pointed to the street Billy and I had run down. Mills drove out of the parking lot and slowly cruised down the street. It looked different during the day, but it still looked familiar. "Now where?" Holly asked. "We spent the night in a shed in someone's backyard." "Point out the house," Holly said. I remembered it was on the right side of the street. Looking for the shed roof above the fence line, I stared out the window. "There." I pointed to the side yard of a house where the shed could be seen above the fence. "Good!" I heard excitement in Holly's voice, but I couldn't work up enough energy to care. Mills pulled up to the curb, and Holly wrote down the address. "Then what did you do?" she asked. "We spent the night in the shed, and the next morning we followed some kids to the high school." "Which direction?" I pointed, and Mills pulled away from the curb. "Turn right at the corner," I said. Mills did as instructed, and after a few minutes the school came into view. "Is that it?" Holly asked. "Yes." "Pull into a parking space, Mills," Holly said. Moments later, we stopped. "Now, Morgan, let me tell you how this is going to go." As she spoke, She pulled a small case out of her purse, then took the torture device out of the case. "You've become familiar with this, yes?" With terror winding its way around my body and squeezing like a thick rope, I nodded. "We're going to walk into the school together, and you're going to look for Bryn. If you see her, do not speak to her. Just point her out to me or Mills." Holly paused. "This is the important part. Do not, I repeat, do not do anything stupid, or I will not hesitate to use this." She held up the torture device. "Are we clear?" I nodded. "One last thing before we go in." She paused. "Describe Bryn to me." Her question was unexpected. Should I tell her the truth or make something up? She held up the device, which decided it for me. "She has long auburn hair that she usually puts up in a ponytail, and she likes to wear dark eyeliner." I felt despicable for telling the truth. Holly smiled and patted me on the knee. Disgusted by her touch, I leaned away from her. Minutes later, the three of us walked through the main doors. There weren't very many kids walking around, as most were still in class. Not far from the entrance was a large open area filled with long tables with benches attached to them. "It's almost time for lunch," Holly said. She led us toward an area that had a good view of the seating space, and we stopped. Mills stood on one side of me, Holly on the other. A short time later, a bell rang. Teenagers poured out of classrooms and flowed in our direction. I studied their faces, searching for Bryn, and hoping with all my heart that she was absent. As if she read my mind, Holly said, "You'd better hope she's here today." What would happen if she wasn't? As I looked at the faces of the kids in the room, I didn't see anyone who looked familiar. Then I noticed some kids looking our way and pointing. Holly must have noticed too, because she sighed loudly and said, "Any luck?" I almost laughed. I was having zero luck lately. Instead, I said, "No." "Are you even trying, Morgan?" she asked with irritation. "Yes, but I don't see her." Then I did. She was walking with two other girls, talking to them, oblivious that dangerous people were here to find her, and she looked exactly like I'd described. With as much as she had enjoyed changing Billy and my looks, I'd hoped she had changed her own. It only took a minute for Holly to notice her too. "Is that her?" She pointed in Bryn's direction. I couldn't deny it, and knowing what Holly was willing to do to me, I was petrified to lie. My head still pounded from the questioning the day before. Feeling sick, I whispered, "Yes." "Mills?" Holly said, gesturing with her head in Bryn's direction. Holly turned to me, warning clear in her eyes. Then she held the torture device in such a way as to remind me that she had it, as if I needed reminding. Mills walked away from us and toward Bryn, who was on the other side of the room. A horde of kids was between him and Bryn, which slowed him down. "Is that Morgan Campbell?" a boy sitting nearby called out. Dozens of heads turned in my direction. Evidently I was famous. And then loud chatter erupted. Several kids started walking toward me, smiles on their faces and cell phones in their hands. Ignoring them, I kept my focus on Bryn, who had been too far away to hear my name. She was deep in conversation with her friends, unaware that Mills was approaching her. "Warn her," my mind screamed. It was bad enough that I'd led them right to her, but now I was going to stand by and watch her be captured? They would inject the same object into her neck that they'd put in mine. I pictured her writhing on the floor in unimaginable pain, telling them where Jack's house was, which would lead them to capture Jack, Danny, Mitch, Kelly, Tracy, Nathan, and anyone else who was at the house. I couldn't stand by and let that happen. A handful of kids were nearly upon me. "Can I take a picture with you?" one girl asked. "Me too," another said. I could tell Holly was getting nervous, but there wasn't much she could do. I glanced at her. She was watching Mills, monitoring his progress as he approached Bryn. Then I looked at her hand. The torture device sat loosely in her palm. Hope surged inside me, a feeling I'd been recently lacking. Could I do it? Could I get away? Deep within my gut, I knew this was my chance, my only chance. Before I had time to think it through, I grabbed the torture device from her hand and bolted away, not even looking back to see her expression. Then I sucked in a deep breath, and at the top of my lungs I yelled, "Bryn, run!" She looked up from her conversation and stared at me. Her eyes widened in recognition, and then she saw Mills bearing down on her. She turned and dashed back the way she had come, putting distance between herself and Mills. Seeing that her chances of escape were good, I hurtled toward the main doors and burst out into the sunlight, my legs pumping harder than they'd ever gone before. When I reached the parking lot, I saw a vehicle with enforcers inside moving toward the school. Panicked that I would be caught, I changed direction and barreled along the school building, staying close to the bushes. I shoved the torture device in my back pocket so that I wouldn't drop it, and kept going. "Morgan, stop!" Mills called from behind me. Not likely, I thought. Adrenaline surged through my body as pure terror pushed me forward. I glanced over my shoulder. Mills was gaining on me, but the enforcers in the other car had turned before reaching the school and were out of sight. I kept up my sprint and cleared the school grounds, but I could hear Mills' feet pounding behind me. Even though I'd had a head start, he was bigger and faster than me. I couldn't outrun him for long, but I was desperate to try. I turned down a street lined with houses. I didn't see anyone around and frantically tried to figure out where to go. I glanced behind me. Mills was catching up. I didn't know what to do to lose him. Then I saw a gate leading to a backyard. It hung open like an invitation. I raced through it, slamming it behind me. A pair of garbage cans were next to the house, and I kicked them over in front of the gate, which I hoped would slow Mills down. I tore around the side of the house and went to the back door, but it was locked. I heard Mills rattling the gate. Complete and utter panic erupted inside me, pushing me into action. I threw myself against the nearest fence, desperate to get over, but my feet refused to gain purchase. Splinters dug into the tender flesh of my palms as I tried to scramble upward. Finally, I managed to pull myself halfway to the top. The edge of the fence dug into my armpits as I tried to heave myself over. Powerful arms wrapped around my waist and tugged me downward. Absolute hysteria gripped me, and I screamed as loud as I could as I kicked at Mills' chest. He ignored my efforts and yanked me to the ground. "Shut up, Morgan," he demanded, but I couldn't stop screaming even if I wanted to, and I didn't want to. I kicked and scratched and fought as hard as I could. There was no way I would go back to Camp Stonewater, or any F.A.T center for that matter. At any moment I expected neighbors to come pouring out of their houses and help me, but there was nothing, not a soul. Were they not home, or were they too frightened to get involved? Mills seemed irritated by my attempt to break free. Finally, he took the stun gun off of his hip, jammed it against my side, and pressed the button. I went limp and silent as I stared at him. A thin track of blood seeped out of a scratch on his cheek. I knew it was from me, but it hadn't been enough to stop him. He looked down at me for a moment, then he pulled a cell phone out of his pocket and spoke to someone on the other end, saying, "I've got her." Then he gave the address of where we were. As I lay there, completely helpless, he took a syringe out of his pocket, and without a word, he slid the needle into the skin of my upper arm and depressed the plunger, injecting some unknown liquid into my body. My vision went black, but I was still aware enough to feel him lift me up and throw me over his shoulder. I felt movement as he carried me off, then nothing. Chapter 59. When I woke up, I was lying in a bed, an IV dripping clear liquid into one of my veins. The back of my neck was sore, and when I turned my head, I saw a bandage on my right arm. Confusion and fear battled for control of my emotions. Where was I? What had happened? I remembered getting away from Holly and running into someone's backyard, and then Mills had caught me and tasered me before he'd injected me with something that had knocked me out. I must be in the medical section of Camp Stonewater, I thought, terrified. Why did my neck hurt? Had they put in a different kind of device? Something that would kill me instead of hurting me? What about Bryn? Had they caught her? I hoped with all my heart that she had gotten away. Then I realized my glasses were gone. Any proof I'd collected would be gone with them. I closed my eyes, the level of my failure crushing me. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remembered was a voice that sounded like Billy's. "I'm sorry she gave you so much trouble," the voice said. My eyelids felt heavy. Was I dreaming? Why would I be hearing Billy's voice in Camp Stonewater? Had they caught him too? Fresh despair washed over me. I'd been so sure he'd gotten away. But wait, why would he be apologizing for the trouble I'd been? Was he in on it too? Keen disappointment shot through me to realize the boy I trusted with my very life had turned against me. Pretending to be asleep, I lay there as the grogginess dissipated, and as I became completely lucid, the sadness and despair at my situation only grew. Then I felt someone lean over me, but I was afraid to open my eyes and verify the truth I didn't want to accept, the truth that I'd been betrayed. "I think she's awake," the voice that sounded like Billy's said to someone else in the room. I couldn't pretend anymore, and I slowly opened my eyes. When I saw Billy leaning over me, looking like himself, and with a wide smile on his face, I didn't know if I should be elated or petrified. "Hi, Morgan." He seemed very happy to see me. "How are you feeling?" My eyes went past him to the person standing in the corner of the room, Mills. He leaned casually against the wall, his enforcer uniform unwrinkled after our chase, although the scratch on his face was pink and puffy. He met my eyes and smiled, then held up the torture device. "I got this out of your pocket." I began trembling, preparing for the inevitable shock that had to be coming. He set the device on a table. "She doesn't need to worry about that right now, Mills," Billy said, looking over his shoulder. My eyes shot to Billy. Was he going to keep them from using it on me? Maybe he did care about me after all. Mills pushed himself away from the wall. "Guess I'd better get going." "Yeah," Billy said. "Thanks for bringing her." Billy watched him leave, then he looked down at me. "I can't believe you're working with them," I blurted as tears filled my eyes. "How could you, after all we've been through?" He looked stunned for a moment, then he laughed. "Oh, Morgan!" I knew I was missing something, but I was too worried about my fate to try to figure it out. He leaned toward me and put his arms out like he wanted to hug me, but I swung my arms wildly. "Get away from me!" I screamed. He straightened abruptly, looking hurt. "You need to calm down." I couldn't believe he would say that to me. He had no idea what I'd been through, what they were still going to put me through. "I think you're misunderstanding what's going on here." He folded his arms across his chest, making no move to get any closer to me. "I'm not working with them. Mills is working with me." That didn't make sense. Mills had stood by while I'd been tortured. Mills had gone after Bryn. Mills had chased me down after I'd finally escaped, then tasered me and injected some sort of sedative into my body. "What?" I said. "Mills is working with the resistance. He brought you to me." He sat on the edge of the bed and softened his voice. "You're safe now, Morgan." Was he telling the truth? Could I trust him? I thought back to our escape from Camp Willowmoss and how he'd protected me. He'd tried to keep me from going back, but I'd refused to listen. He'd only ever had my safety in mind. Yes, I could trust him. Then his words sank into my mind. "I'm safe. I'm really safe." I could hardly believe it. After I'd lost all hope, I was actually out of Camp Stonewater and safe. Waves of relief cascaded over me, making me feel light. Trying to take it all in and digest the fact that I was out of Holly's clutches and the clutches of the people in power, I closed my eyes. After several beats, I opened them and looked at Billy. "Won't Mills get in trouble for helping me escape?" "He's going to tell them that he almost got you, but that you knocked him out, which will explain why he was missing for a while." Do you think they'll believe him? Billy shrugged. Probably, but it's a risk we all take when we work for the resistance. My opinion of Mills changed completely. He wasn't the enemy after all. Instead, he'd risked everything for me. Then I remembered Bryn. What about Bryn? Did she get away? Billy nodded. Yes, and she's gone into hiding. I stared at this boy who had rescued me. Why did you leave me, Billy? Why did you leave Jack's house without saying goodbye? He sighed. It wasn't my choice, Morgan. Danny told me that I was causing you trouble, and that if I didn't leave, she would turn you into the enforcers herself. My mouth fell open in shock. She wouldn't do that. He smirked. Which part? Turn me in. I couldn't take a chance, and that's what she was counting on. Where did you go? He smiled. I'm pretty resourceful, you know. After a few days, I found another resistance group that was a lot more sophisticated than Jack and Danny's group. They took me in. I glanced around the room. And this is their place? Yes. Why am I in this bed? Why does my neck hurt? Mills told us about the device they put in your neck and what it does. We removed it, as well as a tracking chip in your arm. I glanced at the bandage on my arm and touched the bandage on the back of my neck. I really am safe. At least as safe as anyone could be in this world. Tears of gratitude filled my eyes. Thank you. He pulled me into an embrace, and this time I didn't fight it. Oh, Morgan, you know I would do anything for you. He let me go, and I lay back on the pillows. When Mills told me about what they did yesterday, they had to hold me back to keep from going in and getting you myself. I thought about the agony I had experienced, not once, but 3 times. Why didn't Mills stop them? I asked. He couldn't. If he did, his cover would be blown. I understood, but I still didn't know how he was able to stand by when he didn't believe in what they were doing. It was hard for him, Billy said, apparently guessing what I was thinking. He told me it took all of his self-control to just stand there. Why did he give me that sedative, or whatever it was? Billy laughed. He said you were fighting pretty hard, and he thought it would be better if you were asleep while he brought you here. I remembered my terror when he pulled me from the fence. Yeah, you could say I was fighting hard. So now what? The guy leading this group, his name's Nick, is going to review the video you recorded in that camera. Then we'll see what he wants to do next. What day is it? Tuesday. Good. I hadn't been out too long. You know I need to get to that tunnel on Thursday, right? A frown flashed across his face, but it was gone quickly. I figured you were thinking about that. Clearly, he still had doubts about my story. Will you help me get there? He chewed on his lip for a second. I did promise you that I would, so I will. Thank you. How are you feeling, though? Mills said they've only given you power bars for the last week. Yeah, but I didn't eat all that they gave me, so I feel okay. That IV should help get rid of any traces of the drugs in your system. It sounds like this group already knows about the drugs. I told them about them, but they'd heard rumors and were in the process of getting samples. Sounds like this group is way ahead of Jack and Danny's group. He nodded. As unhappy as I am with what Jack and Danny did to us, I know they're doing what they can. They're just a small group. Why don't the different groups work together? Some are, but that can be dangerous too. I mean, what if the enforcers got a hold of one of them and they tell them about the others? He paused. Sometimes it's better to have a little separation. What he said was true. That's exactly what Holly wanted to do. Get to one of the groups so she could get to the others. I guess we didn't hook up with the best group, I said. He half smiled. We did the best we could under the circumstances. He stood up. Hey, are you ready to meet Nick? I know he wants to talk to you. Will you stay with me? Of course. Once again, Billy was by my side, right where I needed him. I smiled at him with gratitude, eager now to face the future. This has been Dare to Defy Part 5, Parallel World Book 3, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2013 by Christine Kersey. Morgan's story continues in Dare to Defy Part 6.